So welcome to our first online lab for Biology 160. Today's lab is covering evolutionary concepts, which we'll also be covering in lecture this week, and also simulation of natural selection. So we'll be learning more about the process of natural selection, the theory of evolution, and we'll be essentially learning about some data that came from a study on the Galapagos from Rosemary and Peter Grant. So some quick brief announcements here. So most of the labs will obviously be online, featured on Canvas. So the way these will work is you'll be reviewing worksheets and analyzing data, and then you'll be uploading your answer to those worksheets onto Canvas. And so I would use those worksheets to also prepare for quizzes. And of course, if you have any questions, please email me. There's my email contact information for lab, or also email me directly in Canvas. That works as well if you have any questions about the quiz or about the lab itself. So remember, one of our goals for the course is to essentially uncover and unlock why we have so many species on this planet. One of our goals is to essentially understand some of the complex relationships that species have, and also ultimately, why do we have so many species on planet Earth in various different habitats? So that's kind of one of our goals for the course. And so we think about this quote here, just to spend a moment reading this quote from Theodopius Dobianski, a very prominent geneticist. And you may have heard this quote before, but essentially the quote goes, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." So I always like to throw that up there because it sort of harkens to why we talk about evolution in Biology 160, why we spend time in organismal biology understanding why we have so many species, because ultimately evolution is and natural selection is a driving process of the end result of having so many species. Some essential questions from today's lab will include what factors cause populations to change over time. Also, what is natural selection? What is evolution? And lastly, like I said, we will be focusing primarily on a study that was conducted, a long-term study on the Galapagos Island, on a small island there by Dr. Peter and Rosemary Grant on the medium groundfinch. So are evolution and natural selection the same thing? Well, we tend to define evolution as descent with modification, and that tends to work for our definition for the Biology 160 class. So if we ever ask you on an exam or quiz, define evolution in 3 words, those 3 words could be descent with modification, because that's the classic Darwinian definition for evolution. So descent from a common ancestor, descent with modification refers to organisms adapting to their environment, so with modification over time. And now you may have been exposed to an alternative definition, a change in genetic composition in a population over time, or a change in allele frequencies in a population over time. That's a more commonly probably cited definition for evolution. However, in this course, descent with modification, those 3 words work on every single exam or quiz. So I would like to mention that. Now, when we think about evolution, evolution occurs at 2 scales, one broad, one small. And so the first occurs at the small scale, that's microevolution. That's within a single population or species. And they got examples of that. You may have been exposed to the biston species of pepper moth. So this is an example that occurred in industrial Europe, where following the Industrial Revolution, the trees around factories became darker, the bark did, such that one morph of this one particular species of moth stood out differently in the background versus what happened before. So that's a really common example of microevolution, or evolution on within a single population or species or on the small scale. Now that contrasts with what we call macroevolution. Now, macroevolution tends to occur at the large scale, at or above the species level. And examples of macroevolutionary events that we'll discuss in this course, mainly in lecture, include the origin of mammals, also the origin of birds, and a number of other examples that we'll mention in lecture and also in lab later on. Now, evolution and natural selection are a little different in the sense I'd like you to think of natural selection as more the process by which individuals with inherited traits tend to survive and tend to reproduce at higher rates than other individuals. And this is essentially the process by which Darwin was trying to elaborate and examine with many examples in his book on the origin of species, by how we get so much species diversity in different habitats. And so really he's talking about the process. So natural selection is really the process by which evolution occurs, whereas evolution is more the theory. Okay, so there's a couple of tenets or fundamental factors that have to be in play for natural selection to occur. The first tenet or the first fundamental assumption that occurs for natural selection is that there is variation. That it means there's variation within a population. So individuals within a population are variable. So we might be talking about a species of turtles. We might be talking about even human beings. We might be talking about a species of birds. So the first tenet or rule for natural selection occurs that there's variation within a population among individuals. Now, the second tenet or the second fundamental for natural selection to occur is that there is inheritance. You may also have heard of this as heritability or inheritance. And essentially, what this means is that the variation among individuals is in some way or form passed from parent to offspring, is inherited. And we also see another tenet of differences in survival and reproduction, and we kind of call this differential survival and reproduction. And what that means essentially is that organisms differ in their ability to survive and reproduce. So there's going to be variation in population, there's going to be inheritance of that variation, then there's going to be differences in survival and reproduction in population. And where we actually get the term natural selection is that these survival and reproduction and selection are essentially non-random. What that refers to is that individuals with the most favorable variations or traits are better at surviving and reproducing and are thus naturally selected. And this is really where we get the term natural selection. And this is really the fundamental of what Charles Darwin was talking about, but it's one of our four tenets of natural selection. Now let's kind of walk through this an example briefly here. Let's say we have an imaginary population of beetles. And so if we see, yes, there is variation in traits, so we can check off our list the first tenet there, or the first fundamental for natural selection. Then we see that there might be differences in survival and reproduction. So let's say that one kind of morph of a beetle, a certain kind of color stands out better against the background. So maybe it's predated upon. So there's differences in terms of who gets eaten, who doesn't get eaten. So there are differences in survival and reproduction, so we can check that off our. And then let's say over time, we see that these traits or the trait for this color morph within this one beetle population is inherited from mothers and fathers to daughters and sons or to offspring. So there is heritability, there's inheritance. And then lastly, over time, if we fast forward this in our example, then we actually see natural selection occurring in a population. So, who is the man behind the theory? Charles Darwin. You're probably more familiar with hearing about Charles Darwin. We'll talk about the formation of his theory more in lecture. And so, Charles Darwin goes as an unpaid intern on Her Majesty's ship the Beagle from 1831 to 1836. And it isn't until 1859 that he publishes On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. So the full title there. So right off the bat, you can tell that there is some time gap between when Charles Darwin sails around the world for 5 years and when he actually gets back, goes through a specimen, thinks through a lot of organismal examples of evolution, and really comes up with this idea of natural selection. He comes up with this idea that species or individuals gradually evolve from common ancestors, and he really talks a lot about natural selection in the sense that species that are more successfully adapted to meet their requirements of various different habitats survived, whereas those that don't essentially die. And so that's really what we mean in terms of the classic Darwinian evolutionary definition for descent with modification. So Charles Darwin's ideas, many of the ideas he actually writes about at length in his book on the origin of species, were obtained from his observations and his collections and his time spent on that ship around the world when he stopped over for several weeks in the Galapagos Island and collected and noticed, made a lot of observations of different species and wondered how did they get to this remote island chain far off the coast of South America. And Darwin observed within birds that are on various different islands in the Galapagos island chain, there's a great deal of variation in beak size and shape among many of the different species and kinds of finches on the Galapagos. So those variations were more common to certain islands that seem to be related to what kind of food they were eating. And so you could look here at this figure. There's a lot of finches that ate fruit. Those that had insects. They're mainly fed on insects, those that fed on cactus, those that fed on seeds. So essentially, there's a lot of correlation between the size and shape of the beak in terms of diet. So what did those birds actually eat? You can actually look at their and measure their their beak size and shape and get some information about what they might be eating. Okay, so some background on the Galapagos finches. So Darwin's finches, it's thought that there was a species of finch that arrived about a little over 2 million years ago, and over time evolved into various different species, depending upon different habitats that they adapted to and different diet on different islands. And so in terms of what we were just discussing, beak shape and size can vary according to diet. So birds here, different finches have a varied diet of insects, spiders, fruit, seeds, termites, nectar, and ticks. And so more recent studies, moving forward from Charles Darwin to the Grant study, which we'll focus on for today's laboratory, Dr. Peter and Rosemary Grant essentially used a very small island within the Galapagos island chain as their natural laboratory. This was an ideal location to study one species, the medium ground finch, one species of bird. And they were able to do this because each year they started visiting the island and capturing and marking over 1,000 individuals. So essentially, they had all individuals on this island essentially marked and tagged. And so they would get up really early, they would tag, they would record data, and the lifespan of the medium ground finch is about 16 years. And so they started going to the island. They initially were just going to go for a few years, and they've been going for over 40 years to this one island. And so that's what the data we're going to talk about today from that long-term experiment documenting evolution in process in the Galapagos island chain. And so what they noted is that beak size was correlated with the size of the seed. What they noted was that bigger beak birds are able to eat larger seeds, whereas smaller beak birds are able to consume smaller seeds. So that kind of makes sense to some extent. So here is the Galapagos island chain and the video. I'll leave the link up there, but the link will be available on Canvas and also on the worksheet. If you take a look here, there is that small island, Daphne Major, within the larger Galapagos island chain. So very small island where they had a replicated island they could control and they could mark all the species of that bird. This gives you an idea of that tribulus seed that they actually, in the video, they'll talk about how hard it was to basically break open. So they'll show some video on that, but just to get an idea of what they look like. So today we're going to be talking about the model activity, or we call it Wingate finches. So we're looking at two different scenarios, and this is the second part of the laboratory that you'll be looking at on Canvas. And we're basically modeling what occurs during a normal year in scenario one, and then scenario two, what happens during a drought year. So let's suppose during a normal year, on this island chain, on this one island, let's say, there's plenty of food. We have both small and large seeds for both small and large beaked birds, or we'll call these wingate finches in our M&M activity for the video. In scenario two, during a drought year, we have, let's say, the conditions for the environment or weather. We have not a whole lot of rain, so over time, many plants fail to bloom and produce seeds. So really only the large seeds are available to wingate finches. Now let's come up with a hypothesis here. So the lab will ask you a couple questions. Scenario one, what do you think might happen based on the video, what they talk about for the grant study? What might happen during a normal year when we have both large and small seeds available? And so what can we predict that during a normal year, what size beak finches will survive and why? So just think about that for a moment as you're answering the laboratory. And then also think about how might this change or compare during a drought year when only large seeds are available. So what might you predict happens during a drought year? What kind of finches or what kind of size beak finches will survive and why? So data from the experiment, the worksheet will ask you to go through the different scenarios, scenario one, scenario two, the normal years and drought years. And so how we actually generated this data, just a little bit of background here, which the lab talks about. Essentially what we set up was a scenario where we had 20 seconds to collect as many seeds as you could into your beak from Wingate Island and place them in the stomach. And we ran this for 3 trials and averaged the results. We also did the same for a drought year. And so we sort of did the same using both large and small beak birds. And that's the actual data for the second part of the worksheet. So that's kind of just a little bit of background for how we actually conducted the experiment or recreated what could occur during the grant study. Okay, with that, that's the introduction to this week's lab. So go ahead and complete the worksheet and upload to Canvas by the due date. So see Canvas for specifics on due dates. Okay, so that's the information for this lab introduction. So go ahead and review the video, review the worksheet, and let me know if you have any questions. With that, I hope you have a great week.